My frozen fingers scraped against the hidden rockslide, revealing not a death trap, but a dugout's dark mouth. Inside, the scent of aged wood and forgotten hope hit me. And then I saw it, a journal, maps to secret pastures, and a promise of survival in this frozen hell. But as I clutched the precious leather, a chilling whisper carried on the wind told me I wasn't the only one hunting for this hidden treasure. And they were already too close. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. My hands, they were used to chalk dust, to guiding little fingers across a page learning their alphabet, not to the biting, stinging cold of the Dakota badlands. Just weeks ago, I was Miss Elsie Mae Johnson, a schoolteacher with a neat little life, visiting my cousin across the state. Now, as the icy wind clawed at my threadbare coat, ripping through the thin wool and finding every inch of my skin, I was just Elsie, a shivering heap of bones and fading hope. The memory of the stagecoach ambush still made my stomach clench tighter than the frozen leather of my boots. Silas Blackwood's men, rough and wild, had descended like a pack of wolves. I remember their harsh laughter, the glint of metal in the fading light, and the way they tossed me out into the swirling snow without a second glance. They thought I was someone else. Or maybe they just didn't care who I was, only what I had, which wasn't much beyond a few clothes and the worn leather satchel I always carried. They took it all, mistaking me for some other poor soul they were hunting, and left me for dead, believing the blizzard would finish the job. The crunch of their horses' hooves fading into the storm was the last sound I heard before the silence of the snow swallowed everything. For days, I truly don't know how many, I just stumbled. My feet were numb blocks of ice, my lungs burned with every shallow breath of the frozen air, and my stomach ached with a hunger so deep it felt like a hollow space. I had no fancy survival skills, nothing but what I'd read in some adventure books back home, curled up by a warm stove. Those stories felt very far away now. My teacher's mind, usually so keen on sums and grammar, was mostly focused on the next step, the next breath, the sheer, burning need to just keep going. Every time I thought I couldn't lift my foot again, a stubborn spark, a tiny, defiant ember, would flicker inside me. I wasn't going to just lie down and freeze. Not yet. The badlands around me were a cruel beauty. Jagged peaks of earth sculpted by wind and ice, endless and unforgiving. The sky was a pale, frozen gray, and the snow, pristine and deep, swallowed any sound, any hope of another living soul. My cheeks were raw and chapped, my lips cracked and bleeding, tasting of salt and despair. I hugged myself tight, trying to squeeze a bit of warmth from my own failing body, but it was like trying to catch smoke. I'd lost my hat somewhere in the drifts, and my hair, usually neatly pinned, was a wild frozen tangle around my face. The weight of my desperation pressed down on me, heavy as a fallen tree. I was utterly broke, desperately alone, and the cold was a living thing, slowly, patiently, trying to claim me. I drifted like a leaf caught in the wind, my vision blurring, my eyelids heavy with exhaustion. I thought I saw shapes in the distance, but they always melted into the snow-laden junipers or the towering sandstone formations. My strength was failing, my legs trembling with every step, and the thought of simply closing my eyes and letting the cold take me started to feel like a sweet, soft promise. But that ember still glowed. Just one more step, Elsie. Just one more breath. I told myself that over and over, a silent mantra against the encroaching darkness. I just kept pushing forward, hoping for anything, a shelter, a sign, a small reprieve from the endless, biting wind. It was then, just as the last of the light began to drain from the sky, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and gray, that I saw it. A strange, almost invisible break in the earth, tucked away, a gully no one seemed to have bothered to claim. My frozen toes stumbled, and I nearly fell. But my gaze caught on something that didn't quite look right. Tucked away between towering sandstone formations and a thick clump of snow-laden junipers, where the cruel wind always seemed to quiet a little, there was a break in the earth. It wasn't an open cave, just a dark, narrow slit, almost hidden by what looked like an old, carefully placed rock slide. It looked like the earth itself was trying to keep a secret. My heart, a tiny, tired bird, fluttered with a desperate hope I hadn't felt in days. This was Whispering Willow Gulch, I later learned, named for the way the wind seemed to murmur secrets through the bluffs. With what little strength I had left, I began to claw at the ancient rocks that blocked the opening. My fingers, stiff and numb, scraped against the rough, cold stone. But a tiny bit of warmth, a breath that wasn't the bitter wind, seemed to seep from the dark opening. I pushed and strained, my muscles screaming in protest, until one large stone finally, grudgingly, shifted. It rolled aside with a soft thud, revealing not a death trap, but a dugout's dark mouth, a deeper, inviting blackness. The air that seeped out carried a faint, musty scent, like old wood and forgotten earth, but also something else, something that smelled of peace. I squeezed through the narrow opening, my body protesting every scrape and bump. Inside, the darkness pressed in, heavy and complete. But the instant stillness was a comfort after the howling wind. I could actually feel my breath, warm in my lungs, not stolen by the bitter air. My eyes slowly adjusted, and as the faint, dying light from outside filtered in, I began to see shapes. This wasn't just a hole. It was a home carved right into the bluff. It felt surprisingly insulated, a true miracle against the biting Dakota winter. There was a sturdy cast-iron stove in one corner, its cold metal surface promising future warmth. Beside it lay a small, neat stack of seasoned firewood, smelling faintly of pine. My gaze swept around the small, silent space. My numb fingers traced the rough-hewn walls. There was a small, steady drip of water from a crevice, pooling into a hollowed-out stone basin, an underground spring, providing water that wasn't frozen solid. My throat ached with thirst, and I cupped my hands, taking slow, careful sips of the pure, cold liquid. It was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. I saw a tin of lamp oil, an old axe leaning against the wall, a sturdy shovel, and a flint and steel, tucked away as if waiting for someone. Several thick, moth-eaten buffalo hides lay folded in another corner, promising sleep and warmth beyond my wildest dreams. Tins of hardtack, salted jerky, dried fruits, and flour stood on a small shelf, enough to keep a desperate soul alive for more than just a few days. But then my eyes landed on it, nestled beneath the buffalo hides. A dusty, leather-bound journal. It felt weighty in my trembling hands, the leather softened and worn smooth by time. Its pages, filled with neat, spidery handwriting, were a world away from the endless, blank snow outside. It was Elias Thorne's journal, I later learned, the original homesteader, a man who had not just survived but truly understood this land. He wrote of ingenious survival methods, of plants that could heal, and of ways to live in harmony with this harsh beauty. But then, as I turned the brittle pages, something else caught my eye, something that made my heart leap with a dizzying mix of disbelief and a fierce, burning hope. There, carefully drawn, were maps, hand-drawn maps of hidden, naturally irrigated pastures, fenceless and protected by the badlands' unique shapes, and the exact location of a year-round, geothermally warmed spring, a spring that would never freeze, vital for any creature in this bitter land. He even wrote of a small, wild herd of incredibly resilient cattle, his own pioneer stock, that had adapted to this unforgiving place and roamed these very secret pastures. This wasn't just survival. This was a lifeline, a blueprint, a promise. This journal, these maps, this knowledge, It was everything. My mind, usually so orderly and careful, raced with possibilities. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a secret, a treasure that could change everything. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could not, would not, tell a living soul about this place. Not yet. Not ever if I could help it. Because if Silas Blackwood, or anyone else, ever found out what I had stumbled upon, they would come for it. And they would come for me. The moment I closed the rock slide behind me, a deep quiet settled. So different from the howling wind outside. It wasn't just quiet, it was still, almost warm. My fingers, though still stiff, felt the difference instantly. I stumbled toward the cast iron stove, my mind fixed on one thing. Fire. I fumbled for the flint and steel, the metal cold and unyielding in my trembling grip. It took me a few tries, sparks flying uselessly against the kindling, before a tiny flicker caught, a fragile, dancing flame. I nursed it carefully, adding small pieces of the seasoned firewood from the neat stack beside the stove. The dry wood caught quickly, and soon a glorious crackle filled the small dugout, followed by the comforting smell of wood smoke. I pushed my frozen hands toward the warmth, feeling life slowly seep back into my fingertips. That first fire was a true miracle. The heat spread slowly, chasing away the bone-deep chill that had been my constant companion for days. I draped one of the thick, moth-eaten buffalo hides over my shoulders, and the rough, heavy fur felt like a warm embrace. My body sagged with relief. I found the tin of lamp oil and an old lantern, carefully lighting the wick. A soft golden glow filled the space, chasing away the shadows and making the dugout feel less like a temporary hideout and more like a real home. My eyes scanned the shelves, finding the tins of hardtack and jerky. The food was simple, tough, and salty, but oh, it was the most delicious meal I'd ever eaten, washed down with cup after cup of the unbelievably fresh water from the trickling spring. With a little strength returning, I started to explore, driven by a teacher's natural curiosity. The old axe felt heavy and clumsy in my hands, unused to such tools, but I managed to chop a few more pieces of firewood, clumsily at first, then with a little more confidence. The shovel, too, was foreign, but I used it to scrape away some of the loose dirt near the entrance, trying to make the hidden space a bit tidier. It wasn't perfect, but every small action, every little bit of tidying, made the dugout feel more like mine. Then, I picked up Elias Thorne's journal again. This wasn't just a book. It was a conversation with a ghost, a survival guide from someone who truly knew these badlands. I curled up on the buffalo hides by the stove's growing warmth, the soft lamplight casting a gentle glow on the worn leather pages. Elias wrote in clear, patient strokes about tracking animals, about finding edible plants even in winter, and about the stubborn resilience of this harsh land. He wrote of using the wind to your advantage, not just enduring it. My mind, usually focused on classroom lessons, drank it all in, eager for every scrap of knowledge. I learned how to identify the particular hollowed-out animal bones and gourds he mentioned, how they could be used to make signals, or even to create sounds the wind would carry. I could almost hear his whisper in the quiet dugout. It wasn't easy. I tried one of his knot-tying tricks for securing the entrance more tightly, and my numb fingers fumbled, dropping the rope several times before I got it right. I tried to sharpen the axe with a small whetstone I found, but only managed to nick my thumb. A small, stinging reminder of my inexperience, but each small victory, like getting the stubborn flint and steel to spark consistently, or successfully using Elias's diagram to clean the stovepipe, filled me with a quiet pride. I was learning. I was becoming something more than just a helpless schoolteacher. The dugout, once a cold tomb, was now vibrant with the heat of the fire, the glow of the lamp, and the crackle of pages turning. As the days turned into a blur of learning and surviving, the dugout became my sanctuary. The cast-iron stove, stoked regularly, kept the little home wonderfully warm, and the constant drip of the spring was a soothing rhythm. I even managed to fix a small crack in one of the old wooden shelves, using a piece of sinew Elias described for mending. I felt a sense of belonging, a fragile peace settling over me. I was no longer just running, I was building, piece by piece, a new existence. One evening, as the fire blazed cheerfully and the dugout felt cozier than any place I'd known, I was studying Elias's careful drawings of the badlands' secret pathways, tracing the lines of his hidden pastures. A profound sense of hope swelled within me. I was warm, I was fed, and I had knowledge that could save me. But then, just as I looked up, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold snaked down my spine. A faint flicker, like a fleeting shadow, danced at the very edge of the dugout's entrance, just beyond the rock slide. It was gone in an instant, but it left behind a chilling certainty. I wasn't alone. That flicker I saw dancing right at the edge of my dugout's entrance, it made a little cold shiver run right through me. Even with the stove burning bright, I told myself it was just a lamplight playing tricks on my tired eyes, or maybe a gust of wind making the snow swirl in a strange way. But that uneasy feeling, it stuck with me, like a burr under my saddle. It wasn't just the cold outside that made my skin prickle anymore. It was something else, something human. After a few more days, nestled safe and warm, with Elias Thorne's journal becoming like an old friend, I knew I couldn't just hide forever. The dried provisions, while a blessing, wouldn't last indefinitely. And Elias had written about specific winter herbs and roots that grew only in certain spots. My body ached for movement too, after so much time cooped up. So one crisp morning, after double-checking the rock slide was firmly in place and scattering fresh snow over my tracks, I ventured out, clutching the journal with its precious maps close to my heart. The air was still, sharp and clean, tasting of pine and ice. I followed one of Elias's less hidden pathways, keeping to the shadows of the bluffs. My eyes, once so used to reading words on a page, were now scanning the landscape, looking for the signs Elias had described. The particular bend in a frozen creek, the way certain junipers grew, even the patterns in the snow. I was learning to see this land differently, not just as a harsh, empty place, but as a living puzzle. It was when I ventured a bit further than I usually dared, towards the frozen tributary Elias called the Knife River, that I saw it. Not another flicker, but something much more solid and unsettling. Fresh tracks, not animal tracks, not a deer or a wolf, but the deep, unmistakable impression of horse hooves, and beside them the heavy, ridged marks of a wagon. They were too distinct, too fresh against the otherwise undisturbed snow, leading off towards the direction of the main trail I'd been ambushed on. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Someone had been here recently, and they weren't just passing through. These weren't trapper tracks. These were different, deliberate, like someone was searching. I followed them for a short distance, keeping to the high ground, my breath puffing out in white clouds. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And then I heard voices, faint at first, carried on the thin, still air. I crouched low behind a cluster of snow-covered pines, straining my ears. Two men on horseback, bundled against the cold, were talking to an old prospector, his beard covered in frost, his pickaxe leaning against a small mound of earth. The prospector seemed nervous, shifting his feet. "You seen anything unusual, old-timer?" one of the riders asked, his voice rough and impatient, slicing through the quiet. "Any hidden gullies? Any signs of old cattle trails? Heard whispers of some lost pastures out this way. Thorne's Land, they called it." My blood ran cold. Thorne's Land. The words echoed in my head, exactly what Elias had written about, what his maps detailed. The other writer, a younger man, added, "Our boss, Mr. Blackwood. He's keen to find him. Pays good for information." Silas Blackwood. The name hit me like a physical blow. The man who had left me for dead. He hadn't just stumbled into these badlands, he was actively hunting for the very secret I now held in my hands. The old prospector just shook his head, mumbled about ghosts and bad luck, but his eyes darted around nervously. The men didn't press him further, only gave him a hard stare before digging their spurs into their horses' flanks and riding off, their wagon tracks scarring the pristine snow as they headed east. I stayed hidden until their forms vanished completely, the hoofbeats fading into the vast silence. My hands were shaking again, not from cold now, but from a different kind of terror. They were looking for the lost pastures, the very ones Elias Thorne had so carefully mapped, the ones that could mean a fortune in this frozen wasteland. And I, Elsie Mae Johnson, the schoolteacher they'd left for dead, was sitting right on top of their greatest desire. They weren't just searching, they were getting closer, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my very core that Silas Blackwood would stop at nothing to claim what he believed was his. That chilling realization, seeing Silas Blackwood's men, knowing they were hunting for Elias Thorne's hidden pastures, made the cozy dugout suddenly feel very small. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm in my chest, and I knew I couldn't just wait for them to stumble upon me. I had to be smart, to think like Elias, to use this land as my protector. My hands, still more used to pencils than axes, tightened into fists. I wasn't going to be a victim again. I spent the next few days working from dawn till dusk, guided by Elias's journal, fueled by fear and a stubborn refusal to give up. The cold was still brutal, but the physical labor kept me warm. My first task was to create what I mentally called the whispering walls of Willow Gulch. I started by building a false trail. With the sturdy shovel from the dugout, I carefully arranged stones and broken branches, just like Elias had described for camouflaging a path. I subtly disturbed the fresh snow, making it look like someone had gone that way, leading away from my true sanctuary. This false path snaked deeper into the badlands, toward a maze of increasingly treacherous, ice-covered gullies and crumbling shale cliffs. It culminated in an exposed dead end, far from my dugout, a place where anyone following would waste their precious time, get utterly exhausted, and feel completely lost without me ever having to show my face. It was a teacher's lesson in misdirection, played out on a grand scale. Next, I focused on the actual path to my dugout, the one I used. Elias had written about listening to the land, and I learned to do just that. I found the dried sinew among the homesteader's relics, tough as old leather, and carefully, painstakingly, tied it into almost invisible tripwires. My fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the knots, but I kept at it, picturing Blackwood's men stepping right into my little snare. I connected these wires to clusters of dried gourds and hollowed-out animal bones I'd found in the dugout, leftover trappers' trophies. I filled the gourds with small, loose pebbles and ice chips. If anyone tripped the wires, these gourds and bones would clatter and rattle with a sudden, jarring noise, a sharp warning echoing through the gully. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. It was slow work, but every knot tied, every gourd hung, felt like a small victory. Then came the whispering walls effect itself. I remembered Elias writing about how the badlands could amplify sounds. Taking some of the water from my miraculous spring, I let it freeze in thin, resonant sheets of ice. These, along with more hollowed-out bones, I carefully placed into narrow rock fissures and natural resonant chambers around the dugout's entrance. When the wind picked up, or if the tripwires were activated, these elements would combine with the badlands' natural acoustics to create an unearthly cacophony, A chorus of mournful howls, piercing whistles, and unsettling rattles. It wouldn't hurt anyone, but it would make them think the gully was haunted, or that a dangerous rockslide was about to happen. It was a clever, non-violent way to scare off anyone who dared to get too close. My hands were raw, my muscles ached, and I was perpetually cold. But the satisfaction of seeing my system slowly take shape was a powerful motivator. I tested the tripwires, watching the gourds jump and clatter. I listened to the wind play mournful tunes through the ice sheets. It wasn't perfect, but it was my defense, built with my own hands, fueled by the knowledge of a man long gone, and born from the desperation of a schoolteacher left for dead. As the sun began to set, painting the badlands in fiery oranges and bruised purples, I returned to my dugout, pulling the rockslide firmly shut. The faint, eerie sounds of my whispering walls carried on the evening breeze, a ghostly serenade. I poured myself a cup of the spring water, feeling the comforting warmth of the stove on my face. My trap was set. No, it wasn't a weapon, but it was cunning, and it was effective. For the first time since Blackwood's men had thrown me into the snow, I felt a genuine sense of safety. I was still alone, still in the wild, but I had built my own shield. But I knew this was only the beginning, because the true prize, those fenceless pastures and that geothermally warmed spring, still lay out there, unguarded, waiting for Blackwood's greedy eyes to find them. The little dugout, once just a cold, dark hole, really started feeling like home. The cast-iron stove, it hummed with warmth day and night, filling the air with the comforting scent of pine and seasoned oak. My hands, which had been so useless and numb, now moved with a purpose. I learned to chop firewood without much fuss, the axe feeling less like a heavy burden and more like an extension of my arm. The buffalo hides, once just moth-eaten covers, were now my softest bed, keeping me snug against the bitter cold that clawed at the walls outside. Every morning, the first thing I heard was the gentle drip, drip, drip of my secret spring, giving me water that was always fresh and never frozen solid. It was a miracle, truly. I spent my days poring over Elias Thorne's journal, his words a steady, guiding whisper in the quiet of the dugout. He wrote about everything, from how to tell the weather by the clouds to how to mend a broken tool with what the land offered. My teacher's mind, always hungry for knowledge, soaked it all up. I learned to stretch the dried jerky and hardtack by adding foraged roots Elias had described, making stews that, while simple, tasted like a feast after weeks of near starvation. The lamp oil tins, carefully rationed, cast a soft golden glow that made the evenings feel peaceful, even when the wind howled like a banshee through the badlands. I practiced his remedies for aches and pains, making poultices from dried herbs I found tucked away in a corner of the dugout. My hands, once delicate, were now calloused, but they were capable. I ventured out more often now, but always with Elias's maps in my head and his caution in my heart. I learned to move silently, like a shadow, melting into the landscape. My eyes, once so fixed on the printed word, now saw every detail: a badger's burrow, the tracks of a rabbit, the way the snow drifted around a particular rock. I discovered tiny patches of hardy winter greens and some late-season berries that Elias had marked on his maps, adding precious fresh food to my diet. Each time I returned to the dugout, pulling the ancient rockslide closed behind me, I felt a surge of pride. I wasn't just surviving, I was living. I was even thriving, in my own quiet, hidden way. But even with my sanctuary and my clever, whispering walls set up, the badlands weren't entirely empty. Sometimes, when I was out gathering firewood a little further from my gulch, or checking on some of Elias's ingenious small game traps, I'd see signs. A faint wisp of smoke from a distant camp, too small to be a regular trapper. Or a set of horse tracks that seemed to be circling, searching, not just passing through. My heart would always give a little jolt, remembering Blackwood's men. One frosty afternoon, I was near a patch of tall, dry grass Elias said was good for kindling, when I saw something that made my breath catch. Fresh hoofprints, bigger than any wild animal, and the unmistakable tread of men's boots. They weren't heading for my hidden gulch directly, not yet, but they were closer than before. And they seemed to be inspecting patches of land where Elias had noted hidden springs. They weren't just looking for me, they were looking for Thorne's land. Back in his grand, well-heated ranch house, Silas Blackwood sat by a roaring fire, nursing a glass of dark whiskey. He listened to his foreman, a burly man named Jeb, report on the latest scouting trips. "We found signs, boss," Jeb grunted, rubbing his gloved hands together. Faint tracks, almost gone in the new snow, but they were there. Human, and near that old Knife River tributary, where you said Thorne's place might be. Someone's out there, all right, and they ain't starving neither. The tracks, they were strong, like someone was moving with purpose. Silas Blackwood's eyes, as cold and hard as the winter outside, narrowed. He'd left that schoolteacher for dead. A small, frail thing. She wouldn't have lasted a night. But these signs, they nagged at him. Someone was indeed doing mysteriously well in a place where no one should be able to survive. And they were too close to the whispers of Thorne's legendary pastures. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He knew who it had to be, or at least who he thought it had to be. He took a long, slow sip of his whiskey. "Jeb," Silas Blackwood said, his voice soft but laced with steel, "send out a bigger party tomorrow. Tell them to find whoever is out there, and tell them not to come back without a clear answer, or without that land." The quiet of my dugout felt different after that last sighting of Blackwood's men. It wasn't just peaceful anymore. It was a stillness before a storm, a breathless waiting. That old saying, "the calm before the storm," it felt true to my very bones. I knew Silas Blackwood wouldn't give up, not with whispers of Thorne's land in his ear. And his men, they were rough, determined, not the kind to be easily discouraged. But I wasn't the same helpless teacher they'd left in the snow. Not anymore. My fingers, calloused now and strong, traced the lines of Elias's map on the worn journal page. My eyes, once a bit nearsighted from reading too many books, now scanned the landscape outside my small peephole, seeing every shift in the wind, every shadow cast by the towering bluffs. I'd worked so hard day after day, driven by that stubborn spark inside me. The whispering walls of Willow Gulch, they weren't just a few bits of rope and gourds. They were my answer, my silent protector against Blackwood's greed. I thought about the false trail, carefully laid out, leading straight into that tangled maze of ice-covered gullies, a dead end waiting for anyone foolish enough to follow. I imagined their frustration, their boots crunching uselessly in the snow, their breath misting in the bitter air as they realized they'd been led astray. A small, fierce smile touched my lips. It wasn't violent, not like their ambush, but it was cunning. It was a teacher's wit against a bully's brute force. And then there were the tripwires, stretched taut and almost invisible, ready to make those gourds and bones clatter and bang. I'd adjusted them just yesterday, making sure they'd carry their message loud and clear. My ears had become attuned to the sounds of this gully, the way the wind sang through the rock formations, the soft thud of snow falling from a branch. I knew exactly how my whispering walls would sound, mournful and strange, amplifying every creak and rustle into something far more unsettling. It would make them think twice, that's for sure. It wasn't just a noise, it was a feeling, a chill down the spine, a whisper of something ancient and unexplainable in these badlands. It would make them nervous, make them question if this land was truly worth the trouble. The dugout was warm, the aroma of simmering jerky stew comforting, but I couldn't quite relax. I had a feeling, a deep certainty that settled in my gut that today was the day. The air outside felt different, too still, too heavy with unspoken promise. I heard the distant, faint crunch of hooves on packed snow, and then, slowly, the low rumble of voices. Not just 2 or 3, but more. A larger party, just as Blackwood had promised his foreman, Jeb. They were here. I extinguished the lamp, plunging the dugout into near darkness, only a faint glow from the stove door remaining. My eyes, adjusted to the gloom, found the small gap I'd left in the rock slide, just big enough to peek through. The cold seeped through the tiny opening, biting at my nose, but I barely noticed. And then I saw them. A line of mounted men, perhaps 8 or 9 of them, spread out across the snow-covered terrain. They were bundled in thick coats, hats pulled low, their faces grim and determined. Silas Blackwood wasn't among them, not directly, but his presence, his greed, was almost palpable in the way his men moved. They rode slowly, methodically, their eyes scanning every gully, every cluster of junipers, every shadow. Their breath plumed white in the frigid air, and their horses snorted, their hooves making dull thuds that seemed unnaturally loud in the vast silence of the badlands. They were following tracks, not mine, but perhaps a general sense of where Elias's journal had indicated the hidden pastures lay. My heart gave a little lurch as the lead rider, a burly man who looked like Jeb, turned his horse's head directly towards Whispering Willow Gulch. He pointed, his arm a dark line against the pale snow, and the others began to follow, their forms growing larger, more menacing, with every measured step. I could almost feel their cold, hard eyes sweeping over the very spot where my whispering walls waited. They were coming, right into my carefully laid trap, and I held my breath, waiting for the first sound of my deterrent to begin. Then, a sudden jarring clatter ripped through the still air. The sudden jarring clatter ripped through the still air. It was loud, sharper than I'd imagined, and for a heart-stopping moment, I actually jumped inside the dugout. Outside, through my peephole, I saw Jeb's horse rear up, whinnying in alarm, throwing the big foreman off balance in his saddle. Another horse shied violently, its rider struggling to keep control. The clusters of dried gourds and hollowed-out animal bones, filled with pebbles and ice chips, had done their job. They rattled and banged with an unholy racket, echoing off the sandstone bluffs around Whispering Willow Gulch, making it sound like something unseen had just burst forth from the very earth itself. Jeb, his face a mask of confusion and anger, shouted at his men. What in blazes was that? Keep your heads, boys! But even he sounded a little shaken. They rode on, more cautiously now, their eyes darting nervously toward the sources of the unsettling noise. They followed the subtly disturbed snow, the broken branches, the carefully placed stones of my false trail, just as I'd planned. They didn't see the true path to my hidden home. No, their greedy eyes were fixed on the obvious, on the trail I wanted them to follow. Slowly, they disappeared into the labyrinthine maze of ice-covered gullies, their voices fading as the winding path swallowed them. I could picture it perfectly from Elias's maps, the treacherous, crumbling shale cliffs, the narrow passages that seemed to lead nowhere. They would have to dismount, pulling their horses through the deepening snow, cursing with every slippery step. The badlands, my silent accomplice, began to work its magic. As they got deeper, the prevailing wind, which always seemed to shift just so in this gully, began to pick up. And then it started. The thin, resonant sheets of ice I'd placed in the rock fissures, they began to sing. A mournful, piercing whistle, low at first, then rising to an unearthly shriek, seemed to thread through the air. It was joined by the hollowed-out animal bones I'd tucked into natural resonant chambers, creating unsettling rattles and moans. The badlands themselves seemed to be groaning, whispering, warning them away. It wasn't a sound any man would expect from nature. Not like that. It sounded haunted, cursed. Like the very spirits of the badlands were rising to meet them. I could hear their agitated shouts now, though muffled by the rock slide. One man screamed, "It's Thorn's ghosts! I tell you this land is cursed!" Another, his voice hoarse with fear, cried, "A rock slide! We're trapped!" Their horses, already on edge, whinnied and stomped, clearly sensing the fear of their riders and the strange, chilling cacophony. The air grew thick with their panic, even from inside my hiding place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon the dead end, the impassable exposed cliff face, far from my actual dugout. They were exhausted, frustrated, and now genuinely terrified by the eerie sounds that surrounded them. Their mission had led them to a cold, empty wall. They looked around, bewildered, at the treacherous, ice-slicked walls of the gully, at the mournful, howling winds that seemed to mock their efforts. They were beaten, not by force, but by a clever trick of the land and a desperate schoolteacher. Just as the last of Blackwood's men were turning their horses, defeated and spooked, a solitary rider appeared on the ridge, overlooking Whispering Willow Gulch. His figure was unmistakable, even from a distance. Silas Blackwood. He'd come himself, likely to see the triumph of his men, or perhaps to oversee the final push. But what he saw was not triumph. He saw his weary, terrified men struggling out of the gully, their faces pale, their horses lathered with fear, the strange, mournful wails and whistles still echoing around them. He saw their failure and the obvious disarray of his well-equipped party. He raised his hand, signaling his men to retreat. He looked directly at the mouth of my gully, the very spot where my rockslide was perfectly disguised, as if he could feel my gaze. His face, usually so composed, was etched with a dark, burning frustration, a dawning realization that the little schoolteacher he'd left for dead was more than just a ghost, and that her survival might just be the key to his undoing. He knew someone was out there, and he knew they had just made fools of his men. I watched through my small peephole as Silas Blackwood's men stumbled out of Whispering Willow Gulch, their defeat as clear as the icy breath pluming from their horses' nostrils. Their shoulders were slumped, their faces pale and drawn, not with cold, but with a deep-seated fear that made even their burly forms seem smaller. The mournful wails and piercing whistles of my whispering walls, amplified by the badlands' natural acoustics, still echoed faintly, chasing them away like an invisible pack of hounds. They looked back over their shoulders, their eyes wide and full of unease, clearly convinced that this gully held something ancient and vengeful. Elias Thorne's cunning, channeled through my hands, had truly worked its magic. The relief that washed over me was a warm wave, spreading from my chest to my fingertips, melting the tension I hadn't realized I was holding. My clever trap, built with ingenuity and desperation, had sent them packing without a single shot fired. It felt like a small, quiet miracle in this vast, unforgiving land. I watched them ride away, disappearing beyond the distant bluffs, their forms shrinking until they were just specks against the endless snow. Silas Blackwood, still perched on his horse on the ridge, was the last to leave. Even from a distance I could feel the heat of his anger, burning like a branding iron. His jaw was set, his cold eyes narrowed, sweeping over the gully as if trying to penetrate its secrets. He had expected a triumph, a quick snatching of the land he coveted. But instead, he had witnessed the humiliation of his men, driven away by what they surely believed was a supernatural force. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he understood now. The little schoolteacher he'd left for dead was not only alive, but was also capable of defending what she had found. He was not just frustrated. He was baffled. And that made him even more dangerous. His defeat here, in this small gulch, would only fuel his ruthless determination. When the last of their forms had vanished, leaving only the pristine, undisturbed snow in their wake, I eased myself away from the peephole. The dugout felt immensely comforting now. A safe harbor after the storm of their presence. I felt my rough, calloused fingers, the ones that had once only held chalk, run over the worn leather of Elias Thorne's journal. His wisdom, his understanding of this land, had been my true shield, a silent partner in my desperate gamble. The little dugout, with its steady fire and the gentle drip of the spring, hummed with a renewed sense of peace. I was no longer a shivering heap of bones. I was Elsie Mae Johnson, survivor and keeper of secrets. I stoked the cast-iron stove, adding a fresh piece of seasoned firewood. The flames danced brightly, casting flickering shadows that made the familiar space feel even cozier. The aroma of simmering jerky stew filled the air, a simple, delicious smell that promised warmth and sustenance. I sat on the buffalo hides, the thick fur soft beneath me, and savored the quiet, the feeling of safety that wrapped around me like a thick blanket. My victory here, in Whispering Willow Gulch, was complete. I had faced Blackwood's men, and I had sent them away. But as I looked at the maps of the hidden, naturally irrigated pastures in Elias's journal, the true prize that Blackwood still lusted after, a cold truth settled in my heart. He had been repelled, but not defeated. His greed was a fire that wouldn't be easily put out. He would be back, and the next time, he would be even more determined, leaving no stone unturned in his relentless search for Thorne's legendary land. My hidden dugout, my whispering walls, had saved me for now, but a new, more dangerous game had just begun. The quiet that settled back into Whispering Willow Gulch after Blackwood's men rode away was deeper, more profound than before. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the quiet of a promise. I watched the last of their figures disappear over the ridge, Silas Blackwood himself a dark, seething dot against the horizon. He'd seen his men humiliated, driven away by whispers and shadows, and that, I knew, would only fuel his hunger. My clever trap had worked, but it was just the first skirmish in a much longer war for this land. Back inside my dugout, the warmth of the fire felt like a hug. My hands, still tingling from the cold, reached for Elias Thorne's journal, the worn leather cool and smooth beneath my fingers. I sat on the buffalo hides, the flames dancing in the cast-iron stove, painting the dugout walls with flickering light. Elias's meticulous drawings, his careful notes on the secret pastures and the hardy wild cattle, they weren't just lines on a page anymore. They were a living blueprint, a legacy. I thought about my life before, Miss Elsie Mae Johnson, the schoolteacher. My biggest worry then was a spilled inkwell or a mispronounced word. Now I was protecting a hidden world, guarding secrets that could mean life or death. The transformation felt complete, deep in my bones. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a keeper. Who to trust? The question whispered in the quiet dugout. The Badlands had taught me a harsh lesson about trusting easily. Blackwood's betrayal, the way he'd left me for dead, it had carved a deep scar. For now, the secret of Thorne's land, the warmth of this dugout, the precious maps, they were mine and Elias Thorne's. I felt a profound connection to that long-gone homesteader, a silent partnership across time. He had entrusted his knowledge to these pages, and now, by chance and by grit, I had become its next guardian. I made a decision not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet, solemn promise to myself. I would honor Elias Thorne's legacy. This wasn't just about my own survival anymore. It was about protecting something truly special, something the Badlands had hidden for generations. This wasn't just a dugout. It was the heart of a dream, the seed of something vast and living. The cattle, the hidden pastures, the year-round warm spring, They were a testament to life's stubborn refusal to be extinguished, even in the harshest places. And I, Elsie May, would be their protector. I took the small tin cup and filled it with water from the underground spring, the surface shimmering in the lamplight. I held it in both hands, feeling the cool, pure liquid. It was a simple, quiet ceremony, just for me. I looked at Elias Thorne's journal, then around the small, welcoming dugout that had become my refuge, my classroom, my sanctuary. My world had been shattered, emptied by the betrayal and the cold. But here, in this hidden gully, I had found something more precious than anything I'd ever known. I had found purpose. I had found the beginning of my own legacy, waiting to be built from the ashes. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.